When you look at old photographs from the 1800s, you see muddy streets, horse-drawn carriages, and narrow pathways lit by gas lamps. Official history books present this era as primitive, raw, and a civilization just beginning to industrialize. Yet right in the middle of this so-called primitive period, structures were rising that humanity would struggle to build even today: train stations. Not just any train stations, miraculous buildings with ceilings reaching 40 to 50 meters, ornate marble columns in every corner, gold-gilded cornices, and a grandeur reminiscent of Gothic cathedrals. London's Street Pancras Station, Paris's Gare de Lyon, New York's Grand Central Terminal, Milan's Central Station, and Istanbul's Circasi Station, all of these were supposedly built in the age of pickaxes, shovels, and horse carts. Do you really believe that? Because if you look at the true story behind the construction of these structures, you will realize there is an unbridgeable gap between what official history tells us and the physical reality standing right before your eyes. And that gap inevitably leads you to a much bigger question: who really built these stations? Listen carefully. Let's start with the architectural absurdity. If you asked a structural engineer today how these buildings were constructed in the mid-1800s, an era without modern cranes, laser measuring tools, prefabricated steel beams, or computer-aided design systems, they would probably tell you it took an extremely long time, a massive labor force, and countless lost lives. But even that answer isn't enough. Because these structures are not merely large, they are geometrically flawless, acoustically engineered, thermally balanced, and synchronized with one another across hundreds of kilometers. During the same period, stations using the same architectural language, at the same scale and quality, were appearing from Europe to America, from Russia to India. This consistency is not a coincidence. It requires centralized knowledge, centralized technology, and centralized will. So where was that center? This is where the matter of Tartaria comes into play. This vast civilization, frequently referenced in old maps and archival documents yet barely taught today, covered much of Eurasia and possessed an advanced system of technology and governance. One of the most compelling claims about this civilization is that it had mastered atmospheric electricity technology. What Nikola Tesla supposedly discovered in the late 19th century was not a discovery at all, it was a rediscovery. And this energy grid was transmitted through specialized structures scattered across the four corners of the globe. Look again at the metal protrusions on top of these buildings, elements long explained away as decorative, antennas, or bell towers. On the rooftops of certain old train stations, particularly those built between 1890 and 1910, there are metal structures that are said to be non-functional today, yet have never been fully removed. Could these structures be purely decorative? I don't think so. Not for a second. These were the visible endpoints of a system through which trains were powered not by coal or steam, but by a grid connected directly to atmospheric electricity. Official history tells you steam locomotive, but it never explains why that massive station building looks remarkably like a power plant. Now let's talk about the hidden networks. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake is recorded as one of the most devastating natural disasters in North American history. But what emerged from the excavations carried out in the aftermath never made it into the official record in any meaningful way. Deep beneath the city, far below the collapsed buildings, intact tunnels, rail tracks, and an underground station network too advanced for anyone to say, "This couldn't have been built in that era," were found. This network was later presented as having been partially rebuilt, but a significant number of researchers argue that these structures existed long before the earthquake and were deliberately concealed. And they may well be right. This isn't unique to San Francisco. Certain sections of London's underground metro system rest on layers far older than the dates they are claimed to have been built. In Berlin, There are underground heating and transportation tunnels that supposedly didn't exist before World War II, yet are clearly visible on bombing maps. Why were these structures hidden? The answer may be even more important than the question itself, because once these structures exist, the entire narrative of "there was no such technology in the 1800s" completely falls apart. And this brings us to the Mudflood theory. All around the world, the ground floors, basements, and even first floors of old buildings are buried beneath the earth. When photographic evidence is examined, even images from the mid-1800s show buildings with windows half submerged in soil. The official explanation for this is urban fill, or ground elevation. But that explanation does not account for this pattern of burial occurring simultaneously across all continents, affecting large public buildings in particular. Many old train stations have lower floors that are inaccessible today. These floors are labeled as storage areas or technical spaces. But some researchers argue that these are in fact the original ground floors, that what was once the street-level entrance is now entirely underground. If that is true, the real scale of these stations is far greater than what we can see. And this phenomenon of burial may be the physical remnant of a deliberate act of erasure. Personally, I believe that is very likely what happened. So why was this erasure carried out? This is where the narrative of the Great Reset enters the picture. There are compelling arguments that in the second half of the 1800s, a simultaneous rebranding operation took place on a global scale. As part of this operation, structures belonging to older civilizations were presented as having been newly constructed or restored. Libraries were purged. Documents predating 1800 were systematically destroyed or locked away from public access. Languages were restandardized, calendars were changed, and most importantly, people were told a rewritten version of their own ancestor story. Train stations are part of this process. These enormous structures were actually the work of a preceding civilization, but we were handed the narrative of, "Behold Victorian engineering, behold the power of the Industrial Revolution." Why? Because being able to say, "We built this," carried with it both legitimacy and a claim to technological superiority. Once the true owners were eliminated, the legacy was seized. And in this story of seizure, airships hold a special place. The airships attributed to the Tartarian civilization were not merely vehicles of transportation. They were also the lifting systems that made massive construction logistics possible. The tons of heavy marble blocks, the enormous steel beams, the rail system stretching for kilometers, things we cannot help but ask, how were these even transported? Cannot be explained without this technology. The airship theory may sound fantastical, but the alternative explanation, horse carts and human muscle, is far more fantastical, because physics calls you a liar. Finally, this needs to be said. After watching this video, the next time you walk past an old train station, pause for a moment. Look at those towering ceilings, those carved columns, and the decorative metal protrusions on the rooftop. Ask yourself, did they really build this with horse carts? I don't think something like that is even possible. And if the answer is no, then who built it? How did they build it? And most importantly, why were we told something different? As always, the truth has been hidden. But we will always keep investigating, and we will keep uncovering it.